lot of people like to play the game, even within the research community, that we'll never know. But I think that's silly. I mean, I think that it's an empirical question, and we can know. By pulling our energies together and working together, we can make changes. I mean, we've gotten releases of documents that have rewritten the whole history. And we all do pray we're wrong. We'd rather be wrong than right. We'd rather not have to live in the world that evidence takes us to. On the other hand, if I had to live in a world where I felt that I couldn't know the truth, that I couldn't know anything, that would be disturbing to me.
Indianapolis Media proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast with your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths comes to die. Stay tuned, be right there.
What is up, everybody, and welcome to the Lone Gunman Podcast. This is episode number 77, and I got a great show for you today. Before we get into that, I'd like to acknowledge the reason I put John Judge at the beginning of this episode is not only because he was a very wise and great man, and he just explained to you, the pitfalls of actually knowing the truth, and you might not actually really want to know it when you get there. But then the other side of the coin is living in a world where you're not able to know the truth, and I don't know which one's worse. We will be talking about John Judge today with our guest Joseph E. Green, among many, many other things. Before we do, I'd like to encourage everybody to go to tlgpodcast.com and check out the new layout, new format, new links posted up over there for you. And also there's a donate button if you'd like to donate to the cause. I would greatly appreciate it. If you enjoy the show, kick me a couple bucks. It goes right back into the show. Also, there's a tab for the Dallas Action where it will automatically pop up a player that will play you the newest episode of my friend Doug Campbell's podcast, The Dallas Action. There's also a tab for Indianapolis Media Group that will take you directly to our new site for all links and research resources and materials and shows and videos and all kinds of great stuff. So please, please, please go check it out. You won't regret it. But first, before we get into the show, a word from my friends over at ROKC.
This is a very dangerous and uncertain world. No one expects that our life will be easy. Certainly not in this decade, and perhaps not in this century.
The ROKC, Reopen the Kennedy Case, proudly presents the first ever Australian JFK conference in Melbourne, Australia this November. Join us on a quest for justice and truth with inspirational speakers and some of the world's leading authorities on the Kennedy assassination. Featured guest speakers include Citizens for Truth about the Kennedy assassination speaker and acclaimed author James DiEugenio, Gail Nix Jackson, author and granddaughter of Orville Nix, and Australia's very own Peter Morris. For more info, buy your tickets at stickytickets.com/Reopen Kennedy Case Conference, because justice is never too late.
What is up, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is the Lone Gunman Podcast, and today I have a great guest for you guys. A prolific author, playwright, musician, contributor to Sitka, Mr. Joseph E. Green joins me on the show. How you doing, Joseph?
Pretty good. How's it going?
Doing just fine. And I'm glad you got in contact with me because I've had my eye on you and a couple of your projects in the past that have really piqued my interest, including King Kill 63.
Well, I wish I could tell you the status. I'm not sure. We are looking for a distributor, and that is basically the director-producer Ryan Page's domain. And so I just get updates from now and then about what's going on, but it has been a while. What we did do was at, I guess, mid-April, we premiered the film at the Dallas International Film Festival. It was a rough cut, and it closed the show. It was the last thing that they showed at the at Dallas International Film Festival, and the audience reaction was terrific. Really went over well. Even though they were watching a rough cut, they were fascinated. They kept me after about 45 minutes answering questions, and finally they kicked us out of the theater. They were just, yeah. People would have stayed and continued to ask questions if they had kicked us out. It was very good. And so what happened was, I guess I should go from the beginning. I originally got hired by Ryan, who has produced several documentaries, including Moog, about Bob Moog, and Blood into Wine, which is about the singer from Tool getting into the wine business in Arizona.
Right.
But he had always been interested in the assassination, and he heard me on Black Op Radio, I think, is what originally happened, and then he got my first book, Dissenting Views, and he contacted me on Facebook. I didn't know who he was at this point, but one of my friends did. It said, "Oh yeah, you want to talk to this guy? He made this great documentary about Tool." And I was like, "Okay." So anyway, we spoke. We got together, and what I was originally hired for was to be a research and script consultant to a movie, to a film called Dallas in Wonderland.
Right.
And I had the background in JFK, and I'm also a playwright, so I know my way around dialogue, and so he thought it was a good fit. And anyway, over the course of making the movie, which we're still in pre-production,
that's a great title, by the way.
What's that?
I said that's a great title, by the way, Dallas in Wonderland.
Yeah, it is, and it's a great script. It was co-written by Adam Parfrey, who's the publisher of Feral House, and Ryan.
Oh yeah.
And it's terrific. I loved it. First time I read it, it's a callback to the films that I like, which are really the American films of the 1970s. And that was one of the things that Ryan and I talked about. His favorite film was Blowout, which is actually an 81 picture, but it has that 70s feel to it. Have you ever seen Blowout?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the notion of making an adult thriller that has conspiracy elements and true elements was very appealing. So we talked about the Parallax View and 3 Days of the Condor and Klute and all, there's a bunch of great films in the 70s that have that feel to it.
Yeah.
That's what they wanted to do. So I was in. But making a movie in Hollywood is it's an incredible process.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's ever really going to happen. It's still in, like I say, still in pre-production. At various times, it seems like we're about to go into production, and then there's a snag or whatever. We've been attached to a bunch of actors. It's been interesting. But in the course of doing this and trying to make the film now in the story, in the movie, the hero or the protagonist, I guess, is making a documentary about the Kennedy assassination. And we had always kind of joked that we were going to make that documentary. And at a certain point, it stopped being a joke, and we said, you know what, let's go ahead and make this documentary. And so we did. We started contacting people, and as it happens in the film now, as it stands right now, we got Oliver Stone and a whole slew of researchers that I think listeners of this show would be familiar with. Certainly my friend John Judge, who I believe that is the last video interview of John that we got in D.C. Dick Gregory, Dick Russell, Dr. Mantic, Dr. Wecht, Vince Palomera. Trying to think all the people we
So basically,
got.
an all-star lineup there. I mean,
It is. It's an all-star lineup. It is. We've got a tremendous, and the footage is great. Doug Horn. We got everybody that we wanted, with a couple of exceptions. And that, because we had gotten all those people, at a certain point, Richard Belzer contacted us because he saw the names and he was like, I want to be part of this. So we shot his interview. So Belzer's in it.
Wow.
Jesse Ventura's in it. We were able to get a great cast of people. And of course, Jim D'Eugenio. We shot a couple interviews with him. And then, while we were making the documentary, I got an email from this guy who had written a new Kennedy book. And we talked for a while, and he was like, maybe this would be a good one for you to review. And so he sent me a review copy, and I loved the book. And that was Joseph McBride.
Oh, yeah.
His book Into the Nightmare, which I'm a big fan of. I love that book. And so anyway, we were talking, and he did all this great work on Tippett. So we brought him in to California. We shot his interview in California, and then later, when we went out to Dallas, we brought him along into Dallas to walk through the Tippett scene. And while we were in Dallas, we also shot, of course, Robert Groden, and we got kind of a tour of Dealey Plaza with Robert. So it's good. I love the film. I love the way it's shot. I think it has an energy that you don't find in a lot of documentaries. It really moves, and the audience just loved it. And mostly, what I want is just for everybody to see it. So we need to find distribution. So but that's still up in the air. So.
Okay. Well, looking forward to that, most definitely. But let's get into your new book. It's called Dissenting Views 2. And something that stuck out with me is, I believe you said in here that you are a former private investigator. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I, too, did a little bit of that in the early 2000s. And I know how, it's glamorized a lot on TV and in the movies, of course, but in real life, it is very, very different than the Hollywood version. Which is probably why neither of us are that anymore. But one thing you can't take out of the special investigator is, of course, wanting to investigate things. And I think that's what your book and your first book is kind of doing without the hassle of actually. All the minutia that goes into actually being a private investigator. But, I can tell just from reading your book that you still have a passion for investigating things. And you spoke a little bit about John Judge, and he's actually the first essay in your book. And I know you kind of had a special relationship with him. And if you could just talk to people a little bit about John Judge and his legacy.
Oh, yeah. Well, the thing about John is that you start kind of with the researcher part, but he was a lot more than just that. He had been a peace activist basically his whole life, and he had been involved in helping the military ever since the Vietnam War. Of course, he protested the war. He had been doing counter-recruitment. So, like, in a high school, the military sets up a bench, and they tell, the high schoolers how great it is to join the military, and he'd get a bench right next to him and explain why everything they were telling him was a lie, which I always felt was really dangerous.
Yeah.
But, he could not be stopped. And he would do things like volunteer to man the phones at suicide hotlines and battered women's shelters, and he was always just doing something. I mean, every time I talked to him, it was, okay, I got to go do this. I got to, I'm going to this church because I'm going to help them with this church. It just, every day of his life, he had made it a point to try to do something for people. And that legacy is somewhat inherited from Mae Brussel. John had his mentors, Penn Jones and Mae Brussel, and he was very much in that vein. of course, we all loved it. That was the thing. And all of the guys who worked on trying to do the tech part of COPA, the conference every year, we all have a very kind of brotherly connection, because we all have this connection through John, which is a joke because I'm no good at tech at all, but if you tell me to do something, I can do it, you know.
Right.
And that's if you were willing to help, it was the help was accepted.
Yeah, he'd find something for you to do.
Conference. What's that?
I said he'd find something for you to do.
Yeah, no, you're right, exactly, and that's what so guys like Rainey Benson and Tim Plainfeather, we still are on each other's emails and things, and his old friends like Dave Radcliffe, who has a great site, by the way, called radical.org, which probably most of y'all are familiar with. But there's also another website that is sort of keeping JJ's spirit alive, which is the Museum of Hidden History. So if you look up the Museum of Hidden History on Google, you'll find some interesting stuff. And if you want to donate money to that, you can. It's a great cause, and they're working very hard to put that together. Marilyn, his partner at the end, and Dave and several other people are working on it. So
right,
we're trying.
Yeah.
But John was just a unique person. I didn't always agree with everything he said, but he opened up my brain to so much that I had been missing. The first time I ever talked to John, we ended up having breakfast and speaking for about 3.5 hours. And after that 3.5 hours, it was like I was in a state of shock at how much I did not understand about American history, and it just changed my life. And I've been hooked on not just the Kennedy assassination, but what Peter Dale Scott calls deep politics ever since.
Right, because I think there's a veil that has come down, across America where they only let us see what they want us to see, and there's very much other things going on behind that veil that we're not privy to, we're never going to know, and probably would have a lot of trouble understanding. But that's just kind of the way I think of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, completely. And that was one of the attractions of COPA, is that it's the Coalition on Political Assassinations, which meant that they dealt with other assassinations, that it wasn't just Kennedy.
Right.
And in fact, some people made a stink about that on the 50th, and very publicly made a stink about it, about the fact that we were inviting somebody to talk about Malcolm X. But it's something we always did every year. We always had people talking about Dr. King, Malcolm X. I spoke about Fred Hampton in 2011, maybe. If you study the Kennedy assassination in isolation, it can become a hobby, and I think for some people it's kind of like being a Trekkie, and I never saw it that way. You're either trying to understand the whole thing or you're not.
Right.
And I'm not trying to discourage people from investigating the Kennedy assassination by any means. But I do think that it's a continuum that, November 22nd, 1963 begins a process that we see going on to this day, to the point that, in 2016, it's very possible that we're going to be voting for a Bush or a Clinton again for president.
Yeah.
It's a very depressing idea.
Yep.
But that doesn't happen, I don't think, unless you have this continuum of power that gets expressed on November 22nd, 1963 first, and then again and again and again throughout the rest of history.
Right. That's why I'm going to vote for D's nuts next year. I can't.
It's excellent, isn't it? 9%, I think.
Yeah.
D's nuts is running at 9-10%.
Yeah. I can't bear the thought.
Going.
Yeah, I can't bear the thought of another Bush or Clinton in the White House, but I'm sure it's going to happen. Probably Bush, I'm guessing, since the Dems just had their turn at 8 years, and It's just, it is exhausting. And, I'm guilty of basically focusing on the JFK assassination only because, there's just so much to it. There's so much there. I mean, you can look at RFK and MLK and pretty quickly, you can come to the realization that, yeah, it's a conspiracy and, here's what happened, basically. But the JFK assassination is a little bit more intricately designed, if you want to call it that,
Yeah, no, and I'm not saying anything negative about that at all, because the thing about the JFK assassination is you can spend all this time on it because there's so many weird angles.
Yeah.
There's so much going on. There's all these tendrils seemingly shooting out in all directions. And I think what happens sometimes is that somebody gets on the trail of one of those tendrils, follows it to its logical conclusion, and then that becomes the theory.
Right.
I said, well, except that it's not just that. It's everything else, too. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, I mean, and also in your book, you addressed the word conspiracy theory as maybe as a label, and I don't like being labeled a conspiracy theorist, and I'm sure you don't either.
No. I mean, it's a funny thing because I talked about that because I noticed that it's a label that basically puts you outside of normal discourse. So if you ever say that somebody's a conspiracy theorist, that means automatically that you don't have to deal with this person at all.
Right, there's a crazy person with crazy theories, yeah.
Yeah, I don't even have to come up with arguments because what you're saying is automatically crazy. And I actually had the thing that sort of made me write this article was I was talking to an uncle, and we were talking about our politics. He's kind of right wing, and I made this crack. I said, well, I'm not really that much of a liberal. I'm only a little to the left of Malcolm X. And I was just, I'm just kidding. But he said, well, that means then you're just out of the circle. And I thought, wow, I'm just out of the circle. That's a really interesting way to put that, And so it made me think of the term profanity, because profanity comes from profanus, which means literally outside the temple. So it's something, you profane something, it means that you've done something on the outside of the temple, on the inside of the temple. And so literally you're profaning things. And if you have a temple, that means you have a certain idea that has to be supported at all times and always respected. And it's not respected because of its intellectual capacity, it's respected because you have to have faith in it. And bottom line, that's what it is. All of the state propaganda of the United States, these ridiculous divisions that we have, the things that people get upset about instead of looking at the real things, those are all elements of the temple. Right.
Yeah, I was talking to this because I have lone nutters on the show every once in a while. Not any of the crazy ones, but every once in a while, it's people that I can have a conversation with, And I was talking to this guy, and he seems to believe that there has been no conspiracies whatsoever in the modern history era. The JFK assassination wasn't a conspiracy. 9/11 wasn't a conspiracy. There's been no conspiracies at all in modern history. And I'm just like, I guess for him, the first conspiracy he sees was possibly the Lincoln assassination. And I just can't, I just don't understand that at all. I wish I could live in that kind of world, but, ever since looking into the Kennedy assassination and seeing what they're capable of doing, or not even actually what they did, but, everything that they were capable of doing, when you actually start looking at everything else in the CIA, and it's just lunacy for me to believe that there's been no actual conspiracies in the last 100 years.
Yeah. Well, and you don't even have to go that far. And what I sometimes tell people, when we're talking, is, look, there's no modern capitalism without conspiracies, right?
Yeah.
Like the collapse of Enron is a conspiracy, right? It's a conspiracy between certain people at the top of Enron, but also all of the banks that did business with Enron, who had the ability to look at their paperwork and understand that their entire monolith was built on sand, but that they could make some money from it.
Oh yeah.
From certain aspects of the oil businesses. I mean, you can't, every time the federal banks get together and make a decision about one way or the other this country, that's essentially a conspiracy. They're making high-level decisions between a very tiny number of people, in some cases like 10 or 12, and that affects all of our lives to extreme degrees.
Right.
How many of you guys voted to go into Iraq? Raise your hands.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't see
everybody
any.
that decided to go into Afghanistan. Where did you send your vote to? Did you write a letter? Or what? How did they ask you whether we wanted to go to Afghanistan?
Right. I mean,
if you don't believe in conspiracies, you don't understand modern politics. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I'm sure some people did, because they bought into the whole terrorist Bin Laden, story. And of course, there was gung ho people that were ready to go attack England if it could be tied back to them. But for people that actually step outside the box for a second and take a look at the big picture, it's quite evident we were lied to, and I mean, it's no reason at all to do that. I mean, if anybody, we should have been attacking Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, if you went by because I was just going to say it. I don't want this to be misconstrued. I'm kidding. But if you were to attack England, that would actually make more contextual sense than attacking Afghanistan. But I'll leave it at that.
Right.
But again, I'm not advocating.
No, I understand. That's a whole other conspiracy when you're talking about the crown and all that mess. So.
Exactly. But I'm just saying, from a historical perspective, that you could make an argument.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. People don't seem to understand anything. Although it's funny because in my job I teach on a day-to-day basis. I teach basically insurance type stuff. But in the context of this, because they have me as a teacher, occasionally I go off on tangents and talk about real things. And I'm always shocked at how receptive folks are to this information. I think that people in the back of their minds have this idea that they are being screwed in a very mysterious way, in a way that they don't necessarily understand. But when they start to hear these things, they kind of say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. At least that's been my experience.
No, I agree with you. I'm 100%, but I think with the average person out there, that they come to the realization fairly quickly that there's nothing they can do about it, and B, they don't have time to worry about it. And I think that's part of the design that's come down, within the past 20 or 30 years, to where, people just don't have the time to worry about that. They got to worry about picking their kids up from school and running them here, running them there, working, both parents working, what's for dinner, what's on TV tonight, and I think, that's kind of the way it's set up. A lot of people don't take the time to look any further than their own little bubble,
Yeah, and you have to make a concerted effort. I mean, what you're doing with your podcast, I'm sure you're making $1 million a week, right, on this thing?
Yeah.
You're living in luxury doing this podcast, right?
Yeah.
No, I mean, and the rewards are few for doing this kind of thing. And you also have a tendency to sometimes get booted out. Like, sometimes people come up to me and say, "Man, you should teach a class on this, and you should become a professor." Do you know how fast I would get fired trying to teach people real history?
Yeah, I mean,
whether it was in high school or college.
Yeah, I mean, they don't want that stuff taught.
I just can't imagine. I don't. You have to do all this. You have to kind of work outside the system, and internet's been great for that. I mean, the internet's like anything else. There's good things and bad things about it, but one of the things that's great about it is that you have a show like this where if people are seeking it out, they'll find it. And these people can be from all over the world. They don't necessarily have to be just from the United States.
Yeah, that's what amazed me when I started doing this, Joseph, is, I can kind of see some statistics of, I can see like the top 10 countries where people listen and the top 10 cities that people listen in.
Cool.
And it's like, it's crazy to see somebody in Taiwan or China or, some little African country, with an interest in all this, because, I know, a lot of people love JFK because, he was so handsome and the whole Camelot thing and this and that. But there's a lot of people that do understand, even not from this country, a ton from Canada, for instance, that realized what happened was not just to America at the time, but it actually affected the whole world.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's no question, right? I mean, what happens if we don't invade Vietnam?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost, I don't even know, I have no idea where to speculate at that point if we don't go into Vietnam. I mean, that changes everything. I don't know. But yeah, it obviously had a lot to do. I mean, Fidel Castro is the classic example, right? He was in the middle of an interview when he heard that JFK was dead, and his first reaction was, oh, God, this is terrible news. Because he knows he doesn't have this, he's not going to have a backdoor channel with Jean Dumont, I think was his name, the reporter, but he also knows that the foreign policy is going to change on a dime. He sees it immediately. Lyndon Johnson is not going to be very interested in me.
No. I mean, could you imagine a world with no warmongers, no CIA? It's just a peaceful world where everybody looks after their own. But that kind of utopia can't last forever. Something else would have taken its place eventually. With technology comes greater weapons, greater jet fighters, and people are always going to be able to be bought. Our senators and our congressmen, and eventually something else would have happened eventually, I think, but that definitely started the ball rolling back then, I believe, and to this day.
Sure, and that almost this is kind of an argument that I have with one of my best friends all the time, which is that I'm always sort of advocating this idea that maybe you can't have a new society until you tear the old one down, and he keeps saying that human nature is human nature. So no matter whatever your good intentions would be, if you started over, inevitably those sociopathic elements would re-enter power, because seemingly those are the kinds of people who try to get power, and you'd have the whole thing repeat itself in 100 years.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's true. I don't know. I go back and forth on that one.
Well, let's swing it back to JFK real quick.
Yeah.
Now, I like you. I have some of my favorite JFK books. Now, a lot of my favorite ones are things like you alluded to earlier, like Joseph McBride's, like Barry Ernest's. Where they actually tell the personal journey of a researcher, and then, also explaining his findings and things like that. That's a much better read than just, somebody putting a bunch of facts in a book and calling it, hey, here we go. Here's my new JFK book, Speak a little bit about Into the Nightmare, and actually getting to meet and talk to Joseph McBride about it.
Yeah, no, Joe is great. We've become good friends. He's a really interesting. I mean, he has a really diverse background. He has written a number of Hollywood biographies of Orson Welles, John Ford, Steven Spielberg, and he has a book of collected interviews with Howard Hawks. He knew all those guys. And he's in the lost Orson Welles film, The Other Side of the Wind that he was in with Peter Bogdanovich and John Huston, which just blows my mind, the fact that he's in The Lost Orson Welles. When he first told me that, I didn't know how to quite react. And he was also a writer on Rock and Roll High School, which the Ramones movie, it's a classic, big movie in my life. But while he was doing all this other stuff over the last, half century, he had this deep affection for Kennedy. He handed out flyers for Kennedy when he was like 12 years old, I think it was. And, attended an event. He got to see and meet Kennedy, and he became a reporter. And in the course of doing that, he sort of took some time off, and he describes that process in the book where he kind of accepted. He had an initial sort of shock, and then he accepted more or less the official version for a while, and then started to come out of the fog and really work on it. And so, but he'd been doing it behind the scenes all this time. So this was somebody who was an insider, a screenwriter, but he also wrote for magazines like The Nation and things. And in the background, he's doing all this work, and he knew he'd become friends with Penn Jones. He had met Mary Farrell and didn't trust her, which I thought was really interesting.
Wow.
And there's a lot of really interesting detail in that book, and I always recommend that book to people because I think it's a big book. It's a big sucker. So maybe that will put people off a little bit. But I think once you get into reading it, it's such a personal story that eventually has all this great information because, like for example, Joe McBride got to talk to people that nobody had ever talked to. He has an interview with Tippett's father, for example, who nobody had ever talked to.
Right.
A lot of really great, So for the researcher, especially in that second half of the book, there's a lot of meat there for you to go after and look at and enjoy. But at the same time, for somebody that was just picking up a new book, I feel like that's a good introductory book because it starts from the personal. It starts from where he was, what he felt, and how he became essentially a conspiracy theorist, right? How did he start to believe that there was a conspiracy involved in the Kennedy assassination? So I think it's a tremendous book. I'm a big fan of his, and I like to promote it whenever I can. I think it's really good. And there's other books, like the Barry Ernest book is another one that's, it's really good. It tells his personal story. Another guy who, actually the first meeting with Penn Jones in that book is hilarious. I don't know if you remember, but Ernest goes to visit him, and the first thing that Penn does is immediately sends him out as a spy to go talk to somebody. He says, I can't talk to this guy anymore. He runs away from me, so go out there and go check him out. He immediately turns him into an agent. But that book, of course, has the big interview, and it doesn't appear anywhere else. And if you're a JFK researcher, you basically have to have that book. So it's always nice when you have the personal insight, a well-written book, because a lot of JFK books are not superbly written, right? There's some books that have great information, but are kind of written like an encyclopedia. But both of those books have good personal stories that take you through, and also have tremendous information for the researcher.
Yeah. Or a lot of books have, like the writer has an agenda, a theory already in mind, and everything he tells you is going to substantiate his theory, this and that, which of course, Joseph,
those tend to be the most useless books, I think.
Yeah, which leads us into one of your other essays in here about Phil Nelson. Now, let me tell you a quick story about Phil Nelson.
Sure.
I happened to be at the Warren Report conference last year in Alexandria, Virginia.
Uh-huh.
And, of course, he was speaking there, as was Ed Tatro and a slew of other LBJ Did It guys, which, personally, I don't subscribe to that theory. But I was open-minded. I would say, okay, I'll sit here and see what these guys have to say. And, of course, I was unconvinced at the end of it all, still. But, I think your take on his book is spot on. And another example of, an author with a theory that leaves out a lot, and kind of misleads people into believing his theory,
leads him to make a lot of assertions that I think are really silly, and that you wouldn't have to make if you weren't so married to this one theory, right?
Yep. You got it.
You know, he has LBJ plotting the parade route. You know, I mean, come on. Even if you believe that sort of Texas did it, which I'm with, I don't really believe that. I think if you stop at Texas, you miss the point.
Yeah.
But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you could write a decent book about this theory. You don't need to do that. In other words, you don't need the whole. And then I know I haven't read it, but I know he doubled down on his new book, because his new book is From Mastermind to Colossus.
Yeah.
And anyway, I'm going to get trashed again. He doesn't like me very much.
He doesn't like me either, so.
I gave him a bad review, but it wasn't personal at all. Now, the other thing that I would say about his book too, and I still stand by it, is that the whole first, I think it's the whole first third. I haven't looked at it in a while. But he basically just rewrote, oh my gosh, the famous LBJ biographer. I just lost his name.
Caro?
Yeah, Caro. He essentially rewrote Caro's information. And if you go and look at the footnotes, it's just Caro. Wait, so what's the point of that?
Exactly.
Why would you summarize somebody else's work? And then the rest of the book is all this stuff about how LBJ killed the president, which I simply don't buy. And it's also this kind of guilt by association thing. It's like, well, LBJ was a really bad guy, and he peed on his Secret Service, which he did. Yeah. And he probably had these other people killed, and probably he did. I haven't really looked into it, but I know that there's these assertions that he killed his sister and all this kind of stuff. He's a dirty politician. He was a bad guy, but I just don't believe that he's the king of the mountain when you're talking about killing the Kennedy assassination. And I would have very little problem with the book if the book were called LBJ Was a Bad Guy.
Right.
Right. I'm not even against the theory that he knew that it was coming. I mean, that's certainly possible. His behavior late in life was unusual. They had a guy kind of watching him because they felt like he might spill the beans maybe or something right when he was about, when he left office, and he was sort of in the last year of his life. But the idea, you have to ignore the military. I mean, in this book he has LBJ giving orders to Hoover. Yeah. If you've read anything about Hoover, that's going to strike you as immediately very implausible that Hoover is LBJ's minion. I just don't buy it. And it is a classic example. You're absolutely right of a book where somebody's bringing an agenda, and he's going to write that book. And no matter what, damn the evidence, damn the torpedoes, this is the book I'm going to write. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, writing a book like that, with an agenda, you're not going to put in anything that doesn't support your claim,
Yeah, exactly. And that's that. So you're doing it all wrong. What you should do is investigate and then report your findings, as opposed to this. Now, having said that, I like Ed Tetra a lot, actually. I've always had an affection for Ed. I feel like if he ever publishes, I know at one time he's working on a book. I don't know if he still is. I haven't talked to him in years, but I feel like his book would probably be better. I might not still agree with the central thesis, because he's still very much an LBJ did it guy, but I think he would have done it better. So there might be some worthwhile things in it, and sometimes there are. Like the book, the Mortal Error book. Yeah, it's another classic one. That Hickey shot the president. Yep. It's not a horrible book, actually. It just has a really horrible thesis. Right. And which makes the book useless. So I can't ever cite anything from that book because it's crazy. The theory is crazy. So even if you do good work, if you put all your effort into your central theory and it turns out to be false, you're essentially invalidating most of the work that you're doing.
Oh, most definitely. And, you can see it in a lot of, like I said, in a lot of these books. And when I talked to Ed at the conference, he's a very likable guy, a very boisterous guy. a very likable guy, you know. And as soon I remember walking into the conference room before the conference had even started on Friday, and man, as soon as we walked in there, my buddy Doug, who does the Dallas Action podcast, he told Tatro, he's like, LBJ didn't do it. Madeline Brown's a liar. You know? And, oh my God, that sent Ed Tatro into a spin, man. I mean, he sat there and started rattling off for like 20 or 30 minutes why we should believe, and he's going to change our minds and this and that. And we're like, oh Lord, what have we gotten ourselves into?
That's funny. Oh man, wait, you gotta harass people. Oh, that's really funny. That's funny. Yeah, I don't believe Madeline Brown either. I mean, I don't like. How do I want to say this? Like, witnesses are very useful in terms of like objective type witnesses that tell you, okay, this is what I saw, and you write, you know, like the Newmans for years stuck to their story. I think they maybe around the 50th, I think they actually changed their story, but the Newmans for a long time, you know, witnesses like that are very useful to putting together an investigation. Then there are other types of witnesses, like the James Files type or the Judy Baker type, that because they're characters in the story, you have to either buy their reality,
right,
or not.
Yeah.
And so it forces people into making this choice. Do I want to buy this reality, or do I want to just move on? And I have generally made the choice to just move on and look at the documents.
Yeah, especially when there's zero supporting evidence of any of their claims. And like you said, man, you run into it very often in this case, where people like to insert themselves into history. Now, you know, Granted, just for instance, Miss Baker's story, you know, sure, she worked at Riley Coffee Company. Sure, okay, you know, she might have actually seen Oswald or talked to him at some point, but beyond that, I can't tell you that any of our story is true. You know, but you know, it's not just her. You know, like it's other people. Like you said, Files. You got, you know, Ron Lewis. You got all these peripheral people that, you know, maybe there's something there, maybe there's not. I'm an evidence guy. I like some kind of evidence to support what you're saying. And if there's not any of that, then I have to kind of push it to the side and dismiss it until maybe somewhere down the road something will come out. But for now, I'm not going to include that in my theory of what happened, you know?
Absolutely. Well, and you know, have you ever met Ed Haslam?
Yeah, he spoke there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so it is very impressive. I mean, you know, if you talk for a few minutes to Ed, I feel like he seems like a guy who's very solid, who is evidence-based, and he gives a presentation, and it's a hell of a presentation. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the presentation, I say, okay, but that doesn't prove that Judy Baker knew Lee Harvey Oswald. Like, there's all this sort of circumstantial evidence to show that she lived in New Orleans at the time.
Right.
But I'm not disputing that she lived in New Orleans at the time. I'm disputing that, you know, she got mistaken for Marina and all the other crazy things that she says happened. And also I had her publisher is this guy Chris Milligan, who I like also, and we were talking and about the Judy Baker conference, and I was kind of saying, you know, you're a very nice guy. You published Trying Day published John Potish's book. Good friends with John Potish. I love his work.
Right.
But I just don't buy Judy Baker, and I can't go to a conference that has her name on it, you know, and so it also, you know, makes it kind of uncomfortable sometimes because, like I say, it's not like I know Chris very well at all. We met a couple times, whatever, but I like him, and I think you know, by and large, they publish pretty good books. I'm not on the bus with this one.
No, I hear you, and I spoke to Chris too at the conference, and because she was there as well. Ed Haslam was there.
Yeah.
You know, it was. I think I went to the wrong conference. I think I probably should have went to the ARC conference, but you know, hindsight's 20/20, and we were kind of working with the guys that were organizing this Warren Commission conference, the JFK Historical Society, Tatro and Denton and all those guys. We're kind of working for them. But looking back on it now, I'm just like, as soon as we walked in there, I knew I was in for a ride, a long weekend. You know what I mean? And I think Chris realizes that whether Judy's telling the truth or not, or her story is real or not, she sells a lot of books. And a lot of people don't realize that Haslam put out a book before Dr. Mary's Monkey that was called Mary Fairy and the Monkey Virus, and this was before Judith had come out. So it's quite possible that she could have got her hands on it, read it, and found an opportunity to kind of insert herself into the story. Now, and people don't also realize that Ed Haslam helped her write her book, and it's kind of a
Mars.
It's kind of
I think Mars did too, right?
Yeah. I think he actually wrote the foreword in her book or something. But it's kind of like a mutual thing. Like, okay, I got a witness now that's going to make my book 20 times better. I'll help her out write her book, and then one's going to corroborate the other, and we'll have this great relationship and sell a lot of books and do this and do that. And I don't know. It's just I get frustrated with it. I've done shows about Judy Baker before, and all that. Just because I remember, I think it was back at the beginning of the year. She had a real big presence online on Facebook and stuff, and she was ready to ready to speak out and stuff. And a lot of people were challenging her with wanting evidence, this and that, and she's kind of crawled back into her shell now. And I know her conference is coming up, and I've seen the list of speakers there, and I'm just like, one of these things does not fit the others, Have you seen the lineup?
Well, I have, and I saw it a while back, so I may not have seen the most recent one. But there are a couple of. I think Dick Russell was gone, right?
I'm not sure.
Was Dick coming? There was a couple of names that I was a little bit surprised.
Yeah, well, Joan Millen popped out of me.
Yeah.
Because I know that she doesn't. She's not big on Judith's story or book, or.
No.
And Judy's not too firm on her. I know Trine Day published one of her books, and I'm sure that's the reason. But I just don't get it.
Yeah, that is weird. Yeah, and you've met Judy, so you kind of know.
Yeah.
How do I want to? Again, I'm going to try to be careful here. I would say that just purely from my perspective, she does not inspire confidence. No. And like I said, I met her and face to face, had a chance to speak to her, look her in the eye, and listen to her presentations and this, that, and the other. And of course, I came away unconvinced as well. But just to speak to her, very nice lady. I will say that. Yeah.
I've got nothing personal against any of these people we're speaking about here, but when it comes to researching the Kennedy assassination and people try to insert themselves into my research, then it becomes my business as well. You know what I mean? And I have to spend my time, looking into their story and either vetting it or realizing that there's nothing here. It's just, I don't know. I was in just that whole weekend is just a big haze for me. Because you know how a conference goes. There's long days. You know what I mean? Long nights.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Always a fun proposition.
Well, and Judy gave us a lot of problems. The 50th in general was more difficult than other conferences to put together. But on the 49th anniversary, John went ahead and invited Judy Baker to speak by remote. And, it was something that I was not in favor of. We had never even, in fact, we had never even talked about having Judy Baker on.
Right.
And so, but I forget when it was. It was, it was probably in the summer. We usually started kind of talking about it at the end of the summer. And he sent me the list, and I said, Judy Baker's on this list. And John was like, well, people keep clamoring for her to speak. Let's let her speak, say her piece, and then, people can make their own minds about what they think. And I said, okay, I guess I can buy that. Because the thing about COPA is the idea was, and other researchers like that, we decided would not be there. And so we decided, okay, fine, I said, okay, I'm registering my objection. So we had the thing, and Chris helped her, and we did the remote, and it was fine. But then, in the lead up to the 50th anniversary, she assumed that she was going to be on the lineup for the 50th.
Right.
And she made this big stink. And so, she has all these, her cult or whatever, they all started hassling John and saying, hey, why are you, you're trying to crush Judy's free speech by not putting her on the 50th when your website says that she's going to be on. And the website had the list for the 49th. All it did is it said she was a speaker on the 49th. But just because you're a speaker at one of the conferences doesn't mean you're automatically going to be a speaker at the next year's conference.
Right.
It doesn't work like that. It's not a bloodline. So anyway, so she causes a lot of hassle, and he ended up having to she and Walt Brown were both very difficult that year. Walt Brown because he decided that we should only have JFK researchers on, and he made a big stink and went on the Black Op radio and said, "Oh, I'm not coming because of this and that." And I've never been a fan of Walt, but so Judy gave some problems there. So I also have a kind of negative appraisal of that as well, because she has a tendency to immediately claim martyrdom if anything doesn't go her way. And it becomes this big, like, all caps, like, oh my God, I'm being persecuted. Yeah. And I don't have patience for that. Like, we're all trying to do something serious, and I don't have time for these kind of emotional outbursts. It's silly.
Yeah, and I mean, if you believe her story, she's a murderer. She is you could try her for treason, since she knew about the assassination and didn't do anything beforehand. The list goes on and on.
Yeah.
But yet, what really got to me was, all these stories of how her life's in danger and these attempted murders, but she's going to come to the nation's capital, okay, with no security. She was traveling with a disabled lady. That was it. Okay, and I just didn't buy any of that necessarily story. That why is she coming to D.C. if she's so worried about what might happen? I mean, hey, the CIA is about 20 minutes that way. The FBI is about 20 minutes that way. It just didn't make sense. But I'm sure that's where the relationship was forged for her upcoming conferences with, Denton and Tatro and Trine Day. And, I'm sure this little conference was her idea. Because I remember originally she said, she was going to have a conference there, but it would be free. She wasn't going to charge admission, this, that, and the other. But now, if you go on the website, it does cost money. So
it's like $60 a day or something, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm sure that comes from the JFK Historical Group guys, because I'm sure they'll want to sell DVDs of it afterwards as well. And I understand all that. If you're going to go through the trouble of doing a conference, of course you're going to want to tape it and sell it, or stream it or something like that. But I wanted to ask you a question about conferences in general.
Sure.
What's your take on them now in the 21st century, this far into it, with the technology that we have, the ability to share information, to collaborate on research? I kind of got the sense last year that it's almost like I don't know. I just got a feeling that it's going to go the way of the dodo real quick because, like I said, nowadays it's so easy to do this, and talk to people and share things and, release your research, to the world. You don't need I know there was a need for them like in the early 90s.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm getting at?
I do, and of course, once COPA dissolved, I haven't been involved in any conferences, and I don't have any immediate plans to be involved in any conferences. It's, of course, and for me personally, it's hard to think of having a conference without sort of JJ there. So it would be. But as far as the technological aspect, I do think that conferences are useful in that they might be smaller in the future, and there might be fewer of them, but I think they'll still stick around. I think we'll still have conferences because there'll still be, even though we can talk on Skype and you could, do a Google presentation or whatever, and you can get a bunch of people to do it that way, there is value in having people come together and just hang out. I mean, especially the COPA conferences the last, 6 or 7 years, mostly they were just a lot of work for me because I was always helping coordinate speaker times. I was, moving stuff from here to there, making sure everything was working, the audio and all this crap. So I didn't get a lot of opportunities sometimes to actually hear the speakers because I was busy doing something else. But afterwards, after all the speakers are done, you go out to eat or something and you find yourself at a table with all these people. Yeah. And, we all have our different takes and we start kind of chatting and gossiping, and I think that has a lot of value. I think that there's something to be said for that, when you, Randy, and I talked about it, I think, in the forward, or I don't remember if I did or Randy did, but my friend Randy Benson, when we first, I think it was the very first conference that I ever went to, and we first met, we ended up getting a coffee with John and Bob Groden, and they were going into the Starbucks ahead of us, and Randy kind of whispers to me, "This is like, if you're a hockey fan, hanging out with Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux or whatever." I don't know. I don't know hockey, so he's going to kill me. I probably had the wrong names. But the point being is it's kind of crazy. What are we doing? We're just having coffee with these guys. And lots of people have that experience at the conferences where you just kind of hang out. And befriend folks, and it's so weird because Facebook is this this NSA data collection thing, and yet it's so useful when you have when Shane O'Sullivan is a friend of mine, and every now and then we might send a message to each other, and he's in Ireland, so it's really easy to use Facebook to communicate with people all over the world,
right?
And to have groups, and a lot of, the reason that I have an interview with Bobby Seale in the book, and the reason that interview came about is that Bobby Seale sent me a friend request on Facebook. So everything is there's good and bad in everything, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that, so I've continued to be on Facebook because even though it, I recognize that they're collecting all my data and putting it somewhere, but they probably are anyway. They're probably collecting yours too, so what the hell do I care, right?
Yep.
Like John used to say, if they're tapping my phones, maybe they'll learn something.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with you about that aspect of the conference. That camaraderie that comes after. When you're hanging out in the bar or just chilling at a table, and I can tell you one thing that happened to me that is kind of a surreal moment. It's hanging out outside and smoking authentic Cuban cigars with Doug Horn and Greg Burnham, and the guy that took Kennedy's body at Bethesda. It's like, is this really happening? And then Doug Horn invites us upstairs to a hotel room to watch a 4K scan of the Zapruder film. With all these guys. So,
you've seen that?
Yeah.
What did you think about those things?
What they didn't show us the whole raw cut that they had. It was just a little bit. I think it was part of, I can't remember which frame it was, but I think there's definitely something there on the back of his head, and with that orange blob going on there, and because Sydney was really nice, and Tom, and Tom was kind of explaining exactly what we're looking at here and why it's acting the way it is, and how it could have possibly gotten like that. And, man, it's seeing it in 4K like that is crazy. I mean, cause you can, you see details that you could never see before. And, I personally, I think there's something there, but,
I never, ever wanted to get involved in that particular dispute.
Right.
I'd never written anything about it. I don't think I've written about it. But anyway, and I was sort of reluctant to even get into it in King Kill 63. And Ryan was really interested in that part, and I was sort of like, well, I don't know. Maybe. And we went back and forth, and we went to Sidney and Tom's house, and they showed us that stuff. And as soon as, man, you look at that thing.
Yeah.
What the heck is that thing? And the provenance of where they got that is, for me, impeccable. Without saying anything further, but I was impressed.
Yeah, me too.
It does really look like there's, and I go back to all the old things that I used to think, why in the hell would they do this? Like, why are they? And the other thing is that Greg Burnham was there, he said, and
yeah.
I really like Greg too. And he should have been in the film. He wasn't, and it's pretty much my fault. I basically screwed up when we were doing scheduling, and Greg really wanted to be in our film too. And I had written up these questions that I was going to add. I was basically in charge of writing the questions to ask the researchers. And Greg liked the questions so much that he gave them to Len and said, and they did a Black Op radio around it. So he got to say the stuff that he would have said in our doc. But that's my one big disappointment is that Greg is not in our doc.
Yeah, you could put him on the cover of that thing and sold like 1 million copies. I mean, that's a good looking man right there.
Yeah, got a lot of charisma. But no, he that whole, he's seen that other copy of the Zapruder film, or at least one of the other copies.
Right.
And, it would be nice to be able to see it myself, but I believe him.
Yeah, I do too. One thing there, he told us about seeing that, and, it's just one of those surreal moments where you're like, okay, let me pinch myself here real quick, because, this kind of thing doesn't happen every day, and it was because of the conference that it happened. And, it was worth every long, grueling hour sitting in that conference room just for that moment, and there were good speakers there, don't get me wrong. But, I guess growing up, I always had this thought that these JFK conferences were something mystical, to where, you would go and you would learn things that nobody else would know. And, all this research would be unveiled at these conferences. And maybe I went to the wrong conference, Joseph.
You did, because actually they can be like that. They can, absolutely.
Yeah, like I said, there was a lot of kookery going on at this one. So, I guess, with that mindset, I guess, when you're trying to convince everybody that LBJ did it, there's not going to be a lot of that. So.
Yeah, no, I always enjoyed myself at every COPA conference, and there was always something I took away from, or met some researchers that I had never met, before, or got kind of the scoop on how they wrote their particular book or how they came to their thesis, and I always found it terribly interesting. Probably my favorite one was in 2008 was the 40th anniversary of the assassinations of MLK and RFK. So COPA, we went to Memphis for the MLK, which was not so much because of the speakers, because we had very few speakers that one, but it was a great experience. But the one that always sticks out in my mind is the RFK conference in 2008, because everybody was there. Everybody that had ever worked on the case was there. The guy who made the documentary, The Second Gun, was there. Bill Turner was there. Bill Turner's great. I love Bill Turner. Anyway, and then in the middle of this thing, he wasn't scheduled, but William Pepper shows up.
Wow.
For like 20 minutes. He just came and gave a quick update, and then he had to go because he was in town for like, I don't know, a few hours. And and we had not scheduled it. It was just like, oh, here's Pepper. Hey, go ahead and talk to us. But Joling was there, and Von Prague. They had just done that new book, and then Lisa was there, of course, because she was doing her. I think I don't know if she had already started her new book, but she wrote that really good essay in the assassinations. It's called something like Crossing the Rubicon or something like that, but it's a really terrific essay about the RK assassination. Anyway, it was really good. And Shane was there. Shane showed some of his film and took a lot of ribbing because the film had come out. He did that BBC thing where there was a misidentification of the CIA agent in the room, which was just an honest mistake by a young guy, and he said it was he admitted the mistake and. Anyway, but it was a great conference because I couldn't imagine that we could get all those different. It would be like having every JFK researcher in the same room. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's crazy. So where could people go? I guess send them to Amazon to get your books.
Yeah, I guess the kind of nexus for everything is dissentingviews.com. That's my website. You could also look up my stuff on Amazon. It's all available. The primary, for this audience, it's going to be primarily Dissenting Views and Dissenting Views 2. I do have a little bit of news on that regard, which I would say if you're thinking about buying the first Dissenting Views, hold on, because I'm re-releasing it. Basically because the first Dissenting Views went through a publisher. I don't have any control over, it's like $20 to buy.
Right.
And it's hard for me, if I want to order copies of it, they're really expensive, and I make hardly anything if it sells. So I'm republishing Dissenting Views in a slightly expanded version. It's going to include 2 new essays, one about King Kill 63, where I'm just kind of reflecting on that, and then the MLK 10-point program. So there's an essay in there called the JFK 10-point program that got a lot of attention when it came out, and this is the MLK 10-point program. So that'll be in there. And everything else that was in the previous book will be in there. So I didn't change anything.
Right. I know.
And that will be out at the beginning of September. I'm thinking September 1, but it might be a little bit later. I'm working on it right now. But that book, I'm thinking the price would be like maybe $12, $13, something like that. So I'll chop off about $8 off the purchase price and give you a little more content.
Awesome. Sounds good. And for the rest of your book, we didn't really do it justice here. This is just a little JFK-centric podcast, but I would encourage anybody out there who's, into history, philosophy, movies. There's all kinds of stuff in here that Joseph talks about, as well as the JFK assassination and the various other assassinations. And I highly recommend it, and much respect, Joseph, for being a doer in this community. You don't meet very many of them. You got your fingers in a lot of pies, you know what I mean? And it takes dedication and hard work. And I got nothing but respect for you, man.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Thanks for saying that. And I want to give one more quick plug to the Hidden History Museum.
Sure.
Check it out. Check it out. It's great. It honors the memory of John Judge, and it's being worked on by Randy Benson, Dave Radcliffe, very good people, and his former partner Marilyn. I support it 100%.
Will do. And I know he had always dreamed of having a brick and mortar museum of hidden history, but in the meantime, until that possibly happens, we'll take the virtual one.
Exactly.
All right, Joseph, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Yeah, it's been great. I really liked it.
Cool deal. Hey, you hang on the line for me real quick. I'm going to talk us out. Everybody, go check out dissentingviews.com for more from Joseph Green, and head over to TLG Podcast, where I'm going to have some cool extras like Joseph's music video.
My music video?
Yeah. And
okay.
and is that your music on your site, that video?
Oh, it is. Oh, so you found fanfic. Yes.
Yes.
That is. Yes,
See?
I am. Yeah.
I do my research.
Playwright, and former PI, and released a new wave album like 50 years after New Wave happened. Yes.
It's Joy Division 2.0, people. You're gonna dig it, especially if you grew up in the 80s and 70s and 80s like me.
Yeah.
But yeah, cool stuff like that. Head over to tlgpodcast.com where you can find a bunch of my old episodes and some cool links to a lot of my friends that I support to do good work in the community. That's it for this week, people. The sumbitch is in the can, beamed up the satellite down directly to your ears. This is your boy Rob Clark. Peace. And also, let me add quickly, I was trying my damnedest to find the trailer for King Kill 63 and play the audio on the show. Unfortunately, it's been taken down from YouTube by complaints from the 6th Floor Museum. So, there's that. So that might be some of the roadblocks that Joseph was alluding to that they're maybe running into with distribution. Getting the rights to show some of the things they're showing in there. So hang tight, and hopefully in the near future we will see it. Hope y'all enjoyed the show. Come back next week. See y'all.
Tell me why you wanna fuck Ronald Reagan. touch. Who wants to fuck Ronald Reagan? I need mechanical. I need mechanical. But I need you tonight. It's mechanical touch. I've had enough of you. I've got too much of love. I need mechanical. I need mechanical. I need mechanical. I need mechanical touch. I need
And that was Joseph's group, Fantic. The more I hear it, the more I like it. It's growing on me. It's like New Order and Nine Inch Nails had sex, and this is their baby. I mean, I'm digging it. So there's a blurb you can use on your album cover, Joseph. Great job. Thanks, guys, for checking out the show. We'll see you next week. TLGpodcast.com, baby. One love.